So The Princess Bride is a thing. That cult classic new age fairy tale that is so full of camp it's hard, if not impossible, not to love. It's crazy that a movie that did so poorly when it first came out now has become this iconic and infinitely quotable piece of pop culture. Everyone has seen this movie, and if you haven't, what is wrong with you? Where have you been? There's something really interesting about this movie. It's so campy that the seriousness with which each scene is played out becomes hilarious. The characters feel 100% sincere, and yet every line is delivered as though a joke, and that makes them all the more memorable. Being campy works out incredibly well for this movie, and I think that if this movie was done in any other way, it wouldn't have captured the same magic. But today's not about campiness in movies, because I already covered that in a dope episode about the nature of art in regards to camp and High School Musical. I still want to talk about The Princess Bride, because I really like it, and this is my show and I can do what I want, but I'm more interested in deconstructing The Princess Bride, because not only is this movie amazingly funny, it's also brilliantly diverse in how it's classified. The movie is categorized by Wikipedia as a romantic fantasy adventure comedy film, which is accurate. It certainly is fantasy and adventure and comedy and romance, and I think is also much more than that. But in that particular phrasing, two words stuck out to me, and they happen to be placed in a way that's specifically separated from each other, but they're both there. Romantic and comedy.
Is this a kissing book?
While doing some research for another project, I found my way to a list, because the internet loves its lists, and there on that list was The Princess Bride. And that list was the top rom-coms of all time. The Princess Bride was voted pretty high on that list, but in my book, The Princess Bride is not a rom-com.
Inconceivable!
But perplexingly, people voted for it as such. I had a lot of arguments lined up for why I disagree with this, until I realized that arguing on the internet is like screaming into a hole in the ground and then burying your head in it while listening for echoes. So instead, I used my valuable not soil-covered head to think about why this listing irritated me so much, and I think this has to do with the way we as a society genreify media and art through our own systems of classification, how that affects the way we think about the art we consume, and how the industries surrounding art use and abuse this system in advertising. I think this movie in particular is actually a great example to use for exploring this topic because it defies a lot of visual storytelling conventions. And so today, I want to talk about The Princess Bride. For starters, if you don't know, The Princess Bride is a novel that was written by William Goldman. The book itself is wildly interesting as it includes a framing device that consists of a fictional version of the actual author describing how he is writing an abridged adaptation of a book called The Princess Bride by a fictional author named S. Morgenstern. Both the author and the original book don't exist, but it does help explain the strange way the story, and by extension the movie, are told. The actual book began as a collection of stories the real William Goldman told to his children. He then placed these bedtime story characters into a thrilling drama in book form and implied that all of the political intrigue of the fictional real story was being skipped over in favor of the drama and adventure. The book was then published in 1973 and was incredibly popular and beloved by those who read it. So beloved was this book that director Rob Reiner wanted to adapt it into a movie some 10 years after it was published. With the success of his strange and hilarious rockumentary This Is Spinal Tap, which again helps explain the comedic tone of the movie, Reiner believed he was in a position to make the Princess Bride movie a reality. William Goldman, the author of the book, is a screenplay writer for big Hollywood films, as well as a novelist. You have likely heard or seen some of his other works. Because of his prominent position in Hollywood, he worked closely with Reiner to write a screenplay that both could be satisfied with, and then Reiner set out to create the movie. The incredible cast includes Cary Elwes, Robin Wright, Wallace Shawn, Billy Crystal, Andre the Giant, Mandy Patinkin, as well as many others. Some of them have gone on to do some crazy big stuff since then. Contrary to popular belief, when the film was released, it actually did okay at the box office. Based on estimates, it made about $14 million after subtracting the cost of the film, which is not a resounding success, but isn't exactly a failure. Of course, the movie really hit it big when it was released on home video, where people could watch it again and again and again and again. I could put a clip here, but why bother when you're already able to repeat lines verbatim? Instead, I'll just put a blank screen and you can pick your favorite line and say it right now. Go ahead. Okay, obligatory spoiler warning for this movie, but I mean really, why are you here if you haven't seen this movie yet?
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
The movie follows a beautiful woman named Buttercup who lives on a farm and bosses around her farmhand, only to discover that when he says, "as you wish," he really means, "I love you." In order to make his fortune so that they can marry, Wesley, the farmhand, leaves, and sometime later, Buttercup, which is a shitty name for a person, receives news that the dread pirate Roberts has taken the ship Wesley was on and he is likely dead.
Murdered by pirates is good.
Sullen and heartbroken, Buttercup vows to never love again. Some time passes and Buttercup is forced into an engagement with Prince Humperdinck, which is undoubtedly the best name for a villain. But before she can marry, she is kidnapped by the trio Vincini, Inigo, and Fezzik. But they are chased by a man in a black mask, who, after besting this trio in duels of steel, strength, and smarts, is revealed to be Wesley himself, who has taken on the mantle of the dread pirate Roberts. Before Buttercup, seriously, it's like the name for a cat, and Wesley can happily be reunited, Humperdinck shows up and threatens to kill Wesley if Buttercup does not marry him. Buttercup now thinks Wesley will stop at nothing to rescue her from this marriage, but she does not know that Wesley was taken by Humperdinck's men to the pit of despair and is slowly having his life sucked out. Inigo the swordsman is dead set on getting revenge on the prince's right-hand man, but he knows he can only get to him with the masked man's help. He finds Wesley and brings him to the wizard named Miracle Max to help bring him back to life. After having been mostly dead all day, Wesley joins Fezzik and Inigo to infiltrate the castle. Inigo gets justice for his father, Wesley reunites with Buttercup, and they live happily ever after. And of course, this is all told to us by a grandfather reading to Fred Savage because he's sick home from school. There's a lot going on in this movie, and that makes it hard to categorize. To me, it feels most like a fairy tale, which is a certain subset of fantasy, and those are not entirely different from the adventure genre. The inclusion of the epic sword duel scene means that a swashbuckler is not out of the question, and that again fits nicely with the adventure and fantasy genre. It goes without saying that this movie is a comedy, and of course the main thrust of the story is perpetuated through the motive of love and revenge, but mostly love. But to say that this movie is a rom-com, I still find that hard to justify. Probably because I don't really like rom-coms. I have a few reasons for that. Most prominently is the emphasis on the comedy part. I find most rom-coms to be distinctly unfunny. Beyond a few key moments, and only in a few movies, I do not find rom-coms funny in the least. For the entertainment value, I would rather watch a straight-up romance movie, even the super cheesy ones, which I happen to like. So what is it about rom-coms that makes them so inherently unlikable, at least to me? But I'm sure others feel the same way. One of the reasons that I always wind up coming back to is that rom-coms tend to be set in a mundane world. That is to say, they are largely focused on regular people doing regular things and falling in love, in quirky and dorky ways that make them adorable. Personally, I find these movies make fairly generic characters with little to no depth and expect us to sympathize with them, which is hard to do. On top of that, we expect these characters to be in a world where normal things happen, but the circumstances they find themselves in are ridiculous or outright unbelievable. But because they're normal everyday people doing normal everyday jobs, and because they're adorably clumsy or a lovable social outcast, this is totally fine and not a plot contrivance. What the actual fuck is a lovable social outcast anyway? A lot of this is based on my own personal experience, but I'm sure you have similar thoughts and likely more complaints you could tack on. But in order to really understand what makes a rom-com, I went right to the source and found a really neat book by a rom-com master screenwriter named Billy Mernit. In his book, Writing the Romantic Comedy, Mernit explains that a good rom-com is based on 7 story beats that need to be hit well in order to work. These are the setup, a scene or sequence that clearly expresses what is missing from the person's life and that they are in some way unsatisfied. In musicals, we call this the I Want song.
I want to be where the people are.
The meet cute. The characters involved need to meet in some way that brings them into each other's lives. This is best done when it's inventive, original, amusing, or cute and doesn't scream plot contrivance. The turning point. A new complication that enables the character or characters to clearly outline their goal. This works best when it places a person's want in direct opposition with their need, or one character's goals in opposition to the other characters. The midpoint or catch. Something that directly connects the protagonist to the antagonist or in direct contrast with their want. The swivel or second turning point. The critical moment where the character achieves their want or is able to achieve their want, but has a revelation about that goal in relation to want and need. The crisis. The character's need is jeopardized by previous actions or the revelation from the swivel, and it appears that their need will never be achieved. The resolution. The point where the main character or characters have sacrificed something in order to show that the need is more important than the want. This doesn't have to be a reconciliation between characters or a happy ending, but more often than not it is, because that's how rom-coms work. These story beats are pretty vague and could probably be applied to many stories, just like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. The biggest difference is that the need or want for one or both characters is love. I don't think it's hard to see that The Princess Bride hits all of these beats, perhaps in unconventional ways, but I don't think it's worth going through them all. Also, I probably just did it visually while going through them anyway. What is interesting is that even with the caveat of love as the goal, a lot of movies actually hit these story beats and would therefore be romantic comedies. Movies you wouldn't even think are romantic comedies. The Disney and Pixar animated movie WALL-E hits every one of these beats perfectly, but you wouldn't call it a rom-com, would you? It doesn't feel like one at all. I'll be the first to admit that The Princess Bride feels more like a rom-com than motherfucking WALL-E. But they both hit all the beats Mernit outlines, and he's the expert. So why does this feel so wrong? It could be because both movies have other things going on and are not placed in the mundane world, but I actually think that there's something deeper at play here, and it has to do with how Western media constructs and perpetuates genres. Genrefication is the process by which media and art forms are placed into categories based on what criteria they satisfy. This is a great system that can help audiences identify features of the art or media that they enjoy so they can seek those things out. A classification or organization system that makes finding the things you want easier. It's great, and there's this huge debate between librarians on whether they should use genrefication or the Dewey Decimal System. Seriously, look it up. People care a lot about this. Classifying things into categories is a great tool, and it makes categories look super clean on paper, but it's actually really unclean. For starters, the obvious thing is that art forms can often fit into 2 or more categories, and often genre is delineated through aesthetics rather than substance. This is particularly problematic in movies and books. Just because a story is set in space doesn't automatically make it science fiction. And as we've discovered, a rom-com does not need to be set in the present day, or even between humans. But this can be further complicated by the fact that genrefication can not only change the way we categorize art, but that it changes the way we think about art. Michel Foucault was a giant in the philosophical movement known as post-structuralism, which was basically a bunch of French dudes from the mid-1900s who thought, how do we know that stuff is stuff and that shit is shit and that some stuff is not shit? Foucault went about answering this by saying that the way we classify things, the organizational methods we use, actually affects the way we think about the world. Humans like to put things into nice, neat categories, but things themselves don't like to be put into categories. Like toys in a play chest. They don't stack nicely, and sometimes there's a teddy bear's leg sticking out. But because we categorize things in certain ways, we begin to think about objects, or in this case art, by the way we have categorized them.
I've never seen a sequel.
At the beginning of his book, The Order of Things, Foucault gives the example of a fictional system of classifying animals he lifted from a book by Borges. The categories are animals that are belonging to the emperor, are embalmed, are tame, are sucking pigs, are sirens, are fabulous, are stray dogs, are included in the present classification, are frenzied, are rodents of unusual size, are innumerable, are drawn with a very fine camel hairbrush, etc., having just broken a water pitcher, from a long way off look like flies. Okay, I added the one about the rodents, but it fits well, right? This classification system is so illogical that it's kind of hilarious. Why would anyone want to use a classification system that has such arbitrary rules? But this is Foucault's point. The rules we use for our classification systems, in this case genre, are entirely arbitrary. We build these rules and then claim that they are inherent in the books and movies we categorize, but we already know that many books don't fit. But it's hard for us to see another system of categorization as useful because we're so entrenched in our own systems. We've brainwashed ourselves, and it's difficult to see it any other way. But there are certainly other cultures that have different classification systems that work. For example, it's like how in The Nightmare Before Christmas, the denizens of Halloween Town are unable to understand Christmas because all they've known is the scares of Halloween. We in the West are stuck in one way of thinking, what Foucault calls an episteme. And this is not a bad thing, but it's important to know that this does affect the way we think about and define things. Now keep in mind, this was a gross oversimplification on my part. Foucault has a lot of writings on this topic, and they're really difficult texts, and I only have so much time, okay? But we can leave Philosophy Town. For now. What occurs within this structure of genrefication is how the industries surrounding these art forms play into and perpetuate genres, causing them to become more distinct than they actually are. And by industries, I mainly mean the Hollywood movie industrial complex. As a commodity and not an art form, film is a huge business, and that means if executives want to make money on the movie, they just spend a butt ton of money on advertising. They play into demographics, another system of categorization, and then what those demographics watch. What genre are they likely to want to see? So they advertise based on these tropes or beats that have worked for successful movies in the past. They play into the specifics of the genre to try and appeal to those who are likely to have seen movies of that ilk. And we wind up with derogatory and problematic terms like chick flicks or rom-coms because of the perpetuation of these movies being advertised towards women of a certain demographic. If a movie does well, then they attempt to find reasons for why and see if they can recreate it enough that it's the same but different. And then we slowly see genres like the rom-com begin to become formulaic, and the aesthetics become solidified into a generic, narrowly defined category. So where does this leave us with The Princess Bride? Is it a rom-com, or a fairy tale, or a Ruritanian, vaguely political comedy fantasy swashbuckler romance? Yes, but also no. Or rather, it doesn't matter. What is more important to remember is that if you like a thing, it doesn't have to be because of the genre that it is in. Because genre is entirely made up, and so are the presupposed demographics that they're aimed at. It would be better to think about the specifics of why you like something, the actual things that happen in the art, and why that brings you joy, or doesn't bring you joy. And then do away with the vagaries of genre, because genres like rom-coms only exist in this particular episteme, in this particular moment in time and in culture. And that is why The Princess Bride could be called a rom-com, and why we often cringe at certain categories that are reinforced by the way we think about and structure our thoughts around art. If you want to hear more about me deconstructing art, I recommend the videos My Little Pony is a Thing and High School Musical is a Thing. I really hope you got to the point of what I was trying to say about genrefication and that it's an arbitrary way to think about art. But it also applies to the sciences and a multitude of other fields. If you weren't aware, there's also this awesome remake of The Princess Bride where they have different actors playing the characters and they switch them up every 5 minutes or so. It's super cheesy and all homemade with like Lego figures. It's the only way I would ever want to see this movie get remade. You should definitely check that one out. I also kind of wanted an excuse to talk about The Princess Bride because even if you don't agree with any of my arguments, how can you not like this movie? It's inconceivable! Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button like your name is Inigo Montoya and it killed your father. Feel free to leave a comment about your favorite part of The Princess Bride, or let me know what you think about genres. You can always catch more awesome episodes of This Is a Thing, as well as our podcast, and the long and the short of it, right here on Cinemaster's Ultimate Timeline.